Welcome, everyone. This is Joe Dager, the host of the Business 901 podcast. With me today is Paul Smith. Paul is one of the world's leading experts on organizational storytelling. He's a keynote speaker, storytelling coach, and author of the bestseller, Lead with a Story, already in its 8th printing. His new book is Sell with a Story. But before we get into that, Paul, tell us sort of the why and how you got into this storytelling world. And, okay, I'm not sure that as a consultant at Accenture or a 20-year veteran of Procter & Gamble exactly is a career path for most storytellers, okay?
Yeah, that clearly was not the career path that logically led to where I am now, for sure. I think, and maybe I'm just a slow learner, Joe, but at some point in my 15 or 20-year career, two-thirds of the way into it, I guess, it finally kind of dawned on me that the leaders that I admired the most and that I wanted to work for, or that I wanted to be like when I grew up in the company, and this would have been at P&G, that they had this really unique skill of storytelling. And as much as I tried to learn about that, I was finding it hard to do. I mean, they didn't teach me that in business school. They didn't teach me that when I joined the company. So I kind of set off on my own little learning journey, interviewing CEOs and executives and salespeople and leaders all over the world, finding out about when they're using storytelling and what stories they're telling and did they work or not. And ended up kind of reverse engineering my way into what is it that makes a great story a great story. And at some point along the way, I decided, gosh, if I want to know this that badly, probably there are other people who do as well. And so it stopped being just my own personal learning journey and started to be an idea for a book. And along the way, I've probably interviewed now 250 or 300 leaders and salespeople and executives and documented 2,000 or 3,000 different stories. So now I feel like I've got a pretty good handle on what makes for a great story and what doesn't.
When we first think of storytelling, we think of that around the campfire type storytelling, right, and everything's going, that everybody's wooting and hooting about, okay, yeah, maybe in that. But what makes a business story different than, let's say, more of that type of story or just a regular storytelling that you might tell your kids at night? Yeah,
so that's a good question. What's the difference? Probably not much. One thing that would come to mind is that you're telling stories at work, so business stories, leadership stories, sales stories, for a purpose that's not entertainment, right? Those stories around the campfire are just for fun, right? And bonding, I suppose. But when you tell a leadership story or a sales story, you have a goal. You're trying to lead somebody to get them to do something differently or to have a different opinion or be more motivated to do something. If you're telling a sales story, you're trying to sell something. You're trying to convince somebody to buy what it is that you're selling. And so the purpose of telling the story is clearly different between the campfire and the boardroom, right? The structure of the stories are remarkably similar. One other difference might be that business stories tend to be shorter. In fact, like how long do you think a typical campfire story would last?
Oh, I mean, the one I start out with normally is the Beverly Hillbillies because I can sing the song through it. Okay.
Yeah. So I don't
more like 10 or 15, I would think something.
Right. Yeah. That's what I think. Those campfire, those Cub Scout campfire stories about the scary thing that happened and the hook on the door, and those are 10 or 15 minute long stories. What I found is that leadership stories average 4 minutes, and they range from a low of 2 minutes to a high of 5 or 6 minutes long. I found, and that was from the 100 some odd different stories that are in my first book, Lead with a Story. For the sales book, the new one, I interviewed salespeople all over the world and procurement people, by the way. So professional buyers, asking them to tell me what are the most effective sales stories you've ever heard. The salespeople I'm asking, tell me the most effective ones you've ever told. And when I averaged those all up, those were exactly half the length of a leadership story. So those were 2 minutes on average, from a low of about 30 seconds up to about 4 minutes. And I think the reason have kind of justified that in my mind is that when you're the leader telling a story to a group of people that work for you, you have a captive audience, right? So it's generally unwise for the subordinate to just get up and walk out in the middle of your story, right? But if you're a buyer listening to a salesperson tell a story, and if they don't get to the point quick enough, then you throw them out of your office, right? So salespeople tend to be much more succinct than the vice president or the president of a company. So that's another difference is business stories are shorter than those campfire stories. And they have a purpose.
When we think of that sales story and we think of that natural person that goes in there and that sales guy that can sell anything and he rolls with it, and I need some structure when I do it. I need help. Have you found that to be true with most sales guys, I guess, or a lot, maybe?
Salespeople in general tend to be more than average good storytellers. I mean, I think there's something about the just gregarious, outgoing nature, extroverted nature of people that are drawn to sales, that end up doing well in sales, that lends itself to them being better storytellers in general than people on average. But yes, I do find them wanting to know, how can I tell my stories better? Because what you don't want to be is a salesperson that goes in and tells a 10 or 15 minute story that should have been a 2-minute story. And having a structure helps you get that 10-minute story down to a 2-minute story. And so that's part of what I teach in the book and in the courses that I teach is, the structure of a story is very simple. It's not you don't use the 17-step hero's journey story structure from Joseph Campbell that you might have learned in some creative writing class in high school or college, because those are designed to tell epic stories, meaning 400-page long stories in 3 hours in a movie theater. If you want to tell a 2-minute story, you need a 2-minute structure, and so that is context, challenge, conflict, resolution. That's it. You need a 4-step story, and then you need to draw the lessons out of that story and drive some action with it. But you need a very simple structure, and that's what I lay out in the book.
And most of the time, even doing a presentation, I should structure my presentation along those same lines.
Well, I think presentations definitely have a structure, but it's different than the structure of a story. The structure that I think we're all taught to make presentations is start out with your recommendation. I recommend that you buy this or approve this or change this about your operating procedure, whatever. And here's my reasons why. I have 3 main reasons why. One, a financial reason, an operational reason, and a marketing reason. And then you go into the details and explain the data that supports that recommendation. So that's kind of the structure of a typical presentation. But that's not the structure of a story. You don't tell the ending of a story up front. But a recommendation is the end of the story of your presentation. But you typically start with it, right? So your audience knows where you're going. So those are very different structures. Now, in that presentation, you might have 30 minutes to make a presentation to the board of directors or something. And in that presentation, you've got 7 points that you want to make, your recommendation, and 6 main points that support it or something. But at 3 places in that 30 minutes, you might want to tell a story. And those might be 2 or 3 minute stories. So you might end up telling 10 minutes worth of stories and 20 minutes worth of normal, expository type speaking in front of your audience. But those stories really punctuate your presentation and add some life and memorability and compellingness to your presentation. But the structure of those 3 stories you've buried in there is very different than the structure of a whole presentation. You don't start with the end in mind. You tell a story the way stories normally happen, and that is beginning, middle, and an end.
And I think that's great advice, and I don't think that's where a business guy, I think, struggles, because he gets that person telling him to tell a story all the time, but then he's trying to put it in place, maybe, right?
Exactly. He's trying to tell it the way we write a memo or the way we make a presentation, and it's just the opposite kind of form. And it's obvious when people do that, and it turns it into something that's not a story, right? I mean, if somebody gets up there and says, look, there are 3 reasons why you got to approve my recommendation, what they're about to do is not storytelling. That's a list. That's list making or list reading or list telling. It's not storytelling, right? If you get up there and you start out, look, 2 weeks ago, our best customer called the CEO on Saturday morning at 6:15 in a panic. Let me tell you what happened. Now you're telling a story, right? And at the end of that story is going to be some recommendation for, and so that's why we need to change our warehousing procedure so that we don't have our customers missing shipments and calling us on Saturday at 6 o'clock in the morning, right? That's the end of the story, not the beginning of the story.
One of the things that really jumps out at me when I think about stories, though, is the sales calls that I mostly remember are the ones where I sat next to someone or I sat there and I talked to them and it kind of ended up, I told them a story about something, even if I was drawing the dirt when I was doing it or whatever. And those probably were my most successful sales calls.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's exactly why I wrote the book, because I learned that from so many salespeople, and not even just from sales, but you go to a conference or listen to a speech or presentation, what you're likely to remember are the stories. You don't remember the bullet points, right? In fact, there are a number of studies that show that facts are between 6 and 22 times more likely to be remembered if they're embedded in a story than if they're just given to people in a list, right? And so if you couch your facts and your data in the form of a story, your audience is much more likely to remember it. And you remember it as the presenter or the salesperson too, but more importantly, your buyer or your audience is more likely to remember it.
You talk about 25 different stories in your book.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That's a lot of things that I can remember. I'm a sales guy. I got short attention span. Okay. Yeah. Is there a way to condense that? Is there something that I should be looking at? Situational, when to use them, when not? Can you kind of tell me how to use that content?
Yeah, so let me explain how I came up with that number. So over the last couple of years, I ended up interviewing professional salespeople and, like I said, professional procurement people at over 50 different companies all over the world. And I was trying to find out, where are great salespeople using storytelling throughout the entire sales process? And I thought, and maybe like you're thinking, that it would probably just be in 2 or 3 places, right? There'd be when I'm building rapport with the buyer, and then when I'm making the primary sales pitch. But that's not what I found. What I found was that great salespeople are telling stories throughout the entire sales process, or a few great salespeople are. Most of us are not, and we could if we only knew that we should. So I found salespeople telling stories all the way from when they met the buyer the first time or the prospect the first time through to that whole rapport building phase. Yes, to making the sales pitch itself, but also handling objections, closing the sale, or negotiating price, then closing the sale, even service after the sale, loyalty building, and ongoing customer relationship management. So there are stories happening all over the sales process. And so what I found in all of those parts, there are a few specific stories being told. So for example, in the main sales pitch itself, there's more than one type of story that great salespeople can and should tell. One of them is just your product's invention or discovery story. Telling the story of how that product was invented, why it was invented to begin with. But then another type of story you would tell in that sales pitch is what I call a problem story. So that's number 13 if you want to keep track. So that's 12 and 13, right? So this is a story that illustrates the quintessential problem that your product or service is designed to solve. So you're not telling a story about the product, you're telling a story about a person or a company that had a problem. And then you can see that problem, you probably have that problem too, and my product fixes that, right? The next story you tell I call a success story, and that is similar to a problem story, except it has a happy ending because you said, now this person, unlike this person, bought my product or service. So let me tell you what happened after they bought my product or service. And obviously the problem goes away, right? So there are different types of stories told at different points in that whole process. So if you want a simpler thing to remember, you can remember just the 4 or 5 stages of the sales process, from introducing yourself, building rapport, make the sales pitch, handle objections, close the sale, service after the sale. You need at least one type of story in each of those buckets. And if you want to go into more detail, there's about 3 or 4 types in each of those that would really behoove you to have.
So when I'm going to, I should be practicing these because I'm not going to come up with 25 of them, So they're very situational.
Yes, you should. So first of all, I'm not going to suggest that everybody needs exactly 25. So the whole list is in the book, and there's one example of all 25 in the book. And so one of the things I encourage people to do at the end of the book is, here's the list of all 25. Go through them with your management, your peers, your subordinates, and figure out which of these do you need for your job, your company, your product that you're selling. You might need 12 of them. Bob might need 17, Sally might need only 7 of them, whatever. But you decide you're going to need some of these, and you're probably going to need more than 1 or 2. So you decide which ones you need. And then I do suggest, as a team, go figure out what they are. I've got an example in the book of each of them, but that you can't use that one. You have to have your own. So there are some exercises I take you through for how do you go find that particular story for you and your product or service. And then, yes, I think that, you ought to practice them as a group. Some of the stories, all of you should be telling. So like the one I mentioned, your product's invention story. Well, that's not going to be different for you and me if we work at the same company and sell the same thing, because it's the same product and it was only invented once. But the story that I tell in the rapport building that tells the buyer about me, who I am and what I'm all about, why I chose the job I chose, that's a personal story about me. Your story is going to be very different. So there, you and I have to go off separately and develop our own stories there. But that product story or that invention story should be the same. And we ought to work on it together to make it as good as we can.
One of the things that I think about is that storytelling. What is the relationship to dialogue? I mean, it shouldn't be really one-sided, should it? I mean, a sales story should not maybe end up with an open question, but should it pause? How should, I want conversation, don't I?
Yeah, you do. I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's one of the biggest problems that I found in barriers to real storytelling, is that salespeople are kind of trained to give a sales pitch, right? So a sales pitch is not the same thing as a sales story. Right? A sales pitch is something you do to someone, that you tell to them, that you say at them, right? Storytelling really creates conversation. And so, yeah, there should be natural pauses and starts and stops. And in fact, one of the more interesting questions I asked the professional buyers was, what is it that makes a sales pitch sound like a sales pitch? And I got all kinds of fascinating answers to that question, but one of them, or the most common answer I got, was it's when the tone of the conversation changes from conversational and extemporaneous to something that sounded scripted and memorized. And they said, that's the moment that I knew that the sales pitch was on, right? And they said, the hairs on the back of my neck would stand up, and I just knew that somebody was trying to sell me something. And so storytelling allows you to just be more conversational, because you're just telling a story. You're not reciting the 7 reasons why you got to buy my product now. You're just telling a story. And if the listener can tell when you've switched from just having a conversation to telling a sales story, you're doing it wrong. You're obviously doing it wrong. It should be totally seamless to the conversation, right? So that's one of the big differences between sales pitches and sales stories, is they are conversational.
I keep thinking, that here I am, as I'm never getting a live person on the phone. Okay, should I be telling a story in my voicemail?
Maybe.
Sure,
but not. Yeah, it'd have to be one of those 30-second one and you can. And one of the chapters of the book, I tell you, how do you take a 4-minute story and turn it into a 2-minute story? Then how do you take a 2-minute story and make it a 1-minute story? And you can follow the same process to make it shorter and shorter. Mm-hmm. But the reason why I'm kind of hedging my answer here is because I'm not suggesting that everything you do should be storytelling. And there are times for stories and times not. Like I told you, you might have a 30-minute sales pitch, and only 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 minutes of that 30 minutes you might spend doing actual storytelling, right? So when you call somebody on the phone and they didn't answer and you've got to leave a message, you may just want to say, hey, this is Bob, call me back, here's my number. I mean, I don't know, but or you may have, just a little bit that you want to share with them of, look, I know you've got this problem, I've got a solution for you, I'd love to talk about it with you, here's my phone number. So it's not all the time that you should be telling a story. But when you do, it might only be 10, 15, 20, 30% of the time that you're speaking that actual stories are coming out. But if you wanted to make a really high impact on that voicemail message, I think telling a story would be radically different than what most people are used to hearing, as long as it is very short, like 30 seconds. And I think you might have better luck getting a response than typical.
We always talk about a story has to start out, maybe with this bang, or that James Bond moment right at the beginning of the movie. Is that true? I mean, can I progressively move into a story slowly?
Yeah, I don't think for the kind of storytelling that I'm talking about around the office that you need that James Bond moment, or that, so there I was in the middle of the African Serengeti and the wolves were just about to attack. I mean, that's what you're talking about, right?
Right, sure.
Yeah, those kind of starts I think are great for movies, for fiction novels, for things like that. I don't think that plays well in business, because it makes it makes it too obvious that you're telling a story. It makes it sound like you're trying too hard, and it's hard to say that kind of thing in conversation. I advocate, and I've got a whole chapter on this, dedicated to this in the book. How do you start your story? And I call it the hook. What's the thing that gets your audience interested in listening to your story? And really, it's just 1 or 2 sentences, and sometimes less than a sentence, that tells the audience that if you keep listening to me, you're going to hear something that's really important to you. So it might be something like, gosh, Joe, that's a tough problem. Well, let me just tell you what happened the last time I ran into that problem last year. Okay. Well, are you interested in hearing what I've got to say now?
Sure.
Of course you are, because you obviously just asked me or told me I have a problem. And instead of me giving you a solution, I'm telling you, I ran into that same problem last year. Let me tell you what I did about it. Now, you don't know if I had success navigating that problem or if I failed miserably. But the truth is, you don't care. You want to hear because either way, you're going to learn something important, right? So I think that's the way to start a story, with that hook that just lets them know, I'm about to tell you something that's very important to you. And then you get into the what I call the context. So it's the where did it happen, when did it happen, and who's the main character and what did they want. I mean, those are the first few questions your story has to answer, and none of them involve that James Bond moment. That James Bond moment happens next, the challenge, right? So that's when you tell what is the problem or opportunity that main character ran into. So that's a paragraph into your story already. So I don't think you have to start with that at all for this kind of storytelling.
Well, and I think you hit a point there that is really so true, is everybody thinks that they have to get to the solution. And really, if you articulate what the problem is and exemplify, most people will accept the fact that you know what the solution is, because you described the problem so well.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. If I've shown you that I understand the problem, then you probably do really want to know what I've got to say, even if I haven't got the solution, because I might have several solutions that didn't work that you probably also want to know about, right?
Yeah. Oh, exactly.
Failure stories.
What's the best way to get started?
Yeah. So first of all, I think people recognizing that storytelling is a skill that it would behoove you to learn about is the first step. And I say that because a lot of people assume that some people are just natural born storytellers. And of course, there are people like that. And some of us are not. And they just make this bad assumption that unless they're born with this ability, they're just never going to have it. And I just think that's not true. So it's like art or music or, like I'm not a natural born artist or musician. But I bet if I wanted to learn to play the guitar, what would I do? I'd go take guitar lessons for 6 months, and I bet I could learn how to play a few songs. Now, I'm probably, just because I'm not naturally gifted that way, I'm never going to end up in Carnegie Hall with 10,000 people paying to. But I could learn to play a few songs. But if you wanted to learn storytelling, some people would say, well, either I just can't learn it, or, well, I guess I would just need to practice more. Well, that doesn't make any sense. Is that how you learn to play the piano, just practice? Well, no, you go learn from somebody who knows what they're doing, right? So read a book, go take a class. I mean, that's exactly what my books and classes are for, but there's other people that write books and teach classes on stuff like that. So go learn first how to do it properly. Then practice it. And, once you've done it 10, 15, 20, 100 times, it'll just become more natural to you. But yeah, you have to learn it first and then take a step and start telling some stories in public to your friends, to your colleagues, to your spouse, to your kids. If you want to practice in a safe place before you try it at work, you can do that. But you're going to have to do it eventually or you're never going to get good at it.
Well, tell me a little bit about the services you offer, okay? Is it just storytelling or what do you do? Tell me your story.
Yeah. So I probably spend I do spend most of my time researching and writing the next books that the books that I write, right? So I'm 3 in, I'm working on number 4 now. So, but probably 25 or 30% of the time, I'm on the road with a client somewhere teaching them the art and the science of storytelling. So that's either with, say, a leadership team of 25 to 30 people in a room for a whole day, and we're literally going through kind of step by step, how do you craft great business stories? What's the structure of the story? How do you find the right story? How do you get the right emotional components in it? How do you use the element of surprise and dialogue and details and length? And we spend time brainstorming, which stories do you need? Like if it's a sales group, I have a whole different training class just for salespeople. And we go through those 25 sales stories and they spend some time picking, well, here are the 15 that we need at our company. And then I spend time with them trying to figure out and find what are those stories that you can use for those 15? And then we use those kind of to practice on as we go throughout the day. So mostly what I'm doing when I'm with a client is teaching them, a half a day or full day training course on using storytelling either for leadership purposes or for sales purposes.
Well, the 2 popular books, you Lead with a Story was a very popular book, okay, that you wrote. Now Sell with a Story has just come out recently. Are they 2 separate books? Does one build on the other? Should I buy both?
Yeah. So yeah, well, of course you should buy both. That's my
Right.
stock answer. But to give you a more serious answer, they're very different in that the Lead with a Story, 75% of that book is really a collection of leadership stories. Right. And, so for topics like setting a vision or leading change or making recommendations stick or defining the culture and the values of the organization or getting people to be more creative and innovative or to work together more collaboratively, most of the book is that collection of leadership stories that you can use as a leader to help accomplish those leadership objectives. Then the minority of the book is about how to do it, the structure and the emotion and the surprise and things like that. For Sell with a Story, I kind of reversed those percentages. 2/3 to 3/4 of the book is about how. So I went much deeper into the structure of stories and the dialogue and details and use of metaphors and all of the hardcore how-to nuts and bolts of crafting a story. So if you really wanted to know how to craft stories, that's the book that I would suggest you get, not with the Lead with a Story book. If you're going to use it mostly for leadership, then I would recommend the Lead with a Story book just to get that collection, because you can start your own repertoire of leadership stories. There's 115 in there for you to start with. Of course, the Sell with a Story book, it's got an example of all 25 of those sales stories. So if you're in sales, you really need that one, because the first third of the book illustrates for you, here are the 25 stories you need, and here's an example of each one of them. And you won't get any of that in the Lead with a Story book. And if you're a salesperson, if you don't know what stories you need to tell, it doesn't matter how good you are at telling them, right? So you really need that first part of the book if you're in sales.
I could go on and on, okay? Very interesting, very engaging, Paul. Where can someone buy the book Selling with Story? Of course, Amazon, but do you have a book website or your website? What's the best way to get a hold of you and learn more?
Yeah, thank you. So the book is Sell with a Story, and you can get it at pretty much any place right now, but Amazon being one of them. But if you go to my website, which is leadwithastory.com, which is just the title of my first book, you can get all my books there and find out more about my speaking and training engagements and stuff like that. And I do some podcasts if people want to listen to the podcast and get a new story every week. That's kind of the way I operate there.
Oh, I look forward to that. I'm going to listen to a couple of them. I haven't yet, and I noticed that on your website this week. So It's leadwithastory.com, right?
That's right. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, Paul. I appreciate it. This podcast will be available on the Business 901 iTunes Store and the Business 901 website. So thanks, everyone, for